Well, hello, my name is Jen Busa. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. Thank you for joining us for the Lunch and Learn, A Silent Revolution, the Mysterious Demise of Slavery in Revolutionary Connecticut. Our presenter today is William Morgan. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Indiana University, Bloomington. He's writing a dissertation about the origins and legacy of emancipation and abolition in revolutionary New England. He was recently at the museum doing some research as a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee. So we're really looking forward to hearing about the project and what he might have found in our collection. So welcome, William.
Thanks, Jen. All right, are we ready to go? All right. Well, I will go ahead and share my screen. It's so great to be here with you all. Here it is, because I'm a Gen Z and I know how this all works. All right, so here we go. So thank you all so much for being here, and just let me know if there's ever any issue with the lag or the Wi-Fi. Just give a shout out and we'll see what we can do. See if I can move around the house. It's like my dad always says when he's doing a Zoom call, that everybody get off the internet, right? So anyway, I'm using the internet. So anyway, but yeah, so I'm William, and here's my presentation. I was so lucky to be in Hartford last summer. So I just wanted to introduce a few things and, of course, give thanks to the Connecticut Museum. I'm so grateful to Jen and her team, the staff at the Connecticut Museum. I had such a wonderful time. It was my first stop, actually, for my NERFC fellowship. And I had a wonderful 2 weeks. And I'm just very grateful. They were just so welcoming to me, including Jen. She stopped by and said hello. I always remember that. That was very kind of her. And she introduced the idea of doing this, and I'm just very grateful and humbled to be able to do it. So I'm William, obviously, and I'm from North Carolina, and originally I'm in Indiana doing my graduate school work in the 6th year of my PhD, and became a candidate a few years ago, which just means I passed my dissertation prospectus defense. And so, yeah, I'm working on emancipation and abolition in revolutionary New England. While I was in Hartford over last summer, I was primarily focused on writing a particular chapter, which I'm still writing right now, about really how emancipation happened. Really in the 1770s, the war years, particularly the early war years, 1775 to 1777. At the time, I was sort of casting my net more broadly, really for the revolution in general, sort of how did emancipation happen specifically in New England. So yeah, my project more broadly, right? It's really about abolitionism. So how do we think about abolition during the very early period before Garrison and Frederick Douglass and a lot of more familiar names? I call it kind of the pre-Garrisonian abolition movement, and really just sort of what did abolition look like? How did it get started? How was it organized? What did activism look like? Things like that. And so those are kind of my emphases, looking a lot at print culture and really tracking to see like how the enslaved population really changed significantly because of the revolution. So I just want to go over a few sort of arguments that I'm making with my project. I want to kind of demystify this. I know, when the scholar talks, it can be hard to parse out exactly what they're saying, and I'm trying to demystify that sort of thing, because I think what we are arguing and how we're intervening in the scholarship should be clear, and if it's not clear to other people, maybe it's not clear to us, right? So, I'm working on revolutionary emancipation. A lot of people have written about this topic, obviously. But I think a key thing to note is I'm really curious about how Black New Englanders themselves crippled slavery as an institution and how there was interracial activism, that is, activism between white and Black actors. And so it's a very exciting thing to write a dissertation about, of course. But here are a few scholars, and I'll just name a few that are on the slide. Manisha Sinha, Paul Polgar, Christopher Cameron, Gloria Whiting, Jared Ross Hardesty, and Gary Nash. So I attached these names to particular sort of focuses for my arguments and my interventions. So And as far as the abolition movement is concerned, I'm trying to think about the long movement starting during the revolution. And so how can we think about the long roots of the abolition movement we know more about in the 19th century and putting those back in the 18th century? So what did it look like at the very beginning, so to speak? And that's something that Manisha Sinha, Paul Polgar, and Christopher Cameron have really focused on. As far as emancipation, and so I'm trying to contribute to those arguments. As far as emancipation goes, Gloria Whiting just recently released a great book called Belonging, which I highly recommend, talking about intimacy and family and relationship in relation to Black people in revolutionary or really early colonial New England. So I'm trying to think about emancipation as she does, as far as happening both on the ground, that is, right, people running away, people negotiating with enslavers, that sort of thing, paired with, or you're serving in the military during the war, for instance, paired with emancipation happening at the state level, right? People formally requesting emancipation and either getting it or not getting it, the state passing certain laws, that sort of thing. So trying to look at it from sort of both levels, top down and bottom up. And as far as Jared Ross Hardesty's work, I really appreciate his look at sort of anti-slavery politics as something which is formal, I guess you could say, and informal. Formal in the sense that it can happen in the legislature or sort of lobbying representatives and that sort of thing. But it can also happen as far as print culture and the intellectual community, for instance, of free and enslaved people in New England in particular, where you have that sort of concentrated literacy, access to the Bible and the Christian identity and things like that, which enable them to advocate for themselves. And I'm interested in how sort of these anti-slavery politics that I'm describing, how that really contributes to the end of slavery and the slave trade, really by the end of the revolutionary period in New England. And lastly, I just want to mention Gary Nash, because he's really sort of a foundational voice for a lot of scholarship in this field that I'm working in. And really the idea that the struggle over slavery, and, of course, this is becoming more in vogue now, but the idea that the struggle over slavery was central to the revolution itself. And I think that's really just a critical intervention. And it's a very timely intervention now in our time, I think, as more and more people are coming around to that. So trying to see, kind of exactly how slavery was being challenged, and of course was challenging itself to revolutionary actors. So those are kind of the arguments and the interventions that I'm making and examining. As far as my methodology, and I love how, scholars throw around this word, it feels like such a 50-cent word, but yeah, it's just like our method. And, for me, it's a lot of print culture, because New England is so lucky in being so rich in print materials, as the Connecticut Museum people know. And, when I was there, I was just astounded by how many documents I was able to look at. And I'm going to show you a few of those documents. And I'm very excited to do that, to showcase their collections, which are just completely amazing and enabled me to do a lot of my research while I was there. But I'm interested, right, not just in print things that were printed, but obviously, a lot was on paper, and, a lot of documents, not just newspapers, right, but, bills of sale and, and various other documents, which can help paint a larger picture of slavery during the period. So I'm really trying to map sort of what I call the textual activism, the activism in print culture as far as newspapers and pamphlets. But I'm also tracking sort of what I call the aggregate data. And that almost sounds like maybe I'm sort of like some sort of mathematician. I did pretty well in math in school, but I'm no mathematician. I suppose what I just mean by that is kind of the aggregate data as far as how are the numbers changing, how many bills of sale are there, how many wills are there that mention enslaved people, just sort of compiling that sort of data, because I'm really interested in tracking that data over time and how it ebbs and flows, or how many enslaved people were being imported at any one time. And lastly, I'm really interested in sort of the personal and community connections. So the idea of understanding networks. And of course, at this time, during the anti-slavery, I like to call it a movement, because I think it was established enough to be so. We were talking about sort of very preliminary attempts at networks, and that is networks between enslaved people and free Black people, between enslaved and freeback people and white colonists. So things like that, and the idea of their connecting through print as well as in person, and some of those relationships that happen in person that go unrecorded, I try to sort of suss out using the documents that are available. And I think all of those connections, and I really like to call them connections between people using print, between people having different negotiations. That's really critical to the work of activism and organizing, I would argue. So, some big questions from my research that I have pretty much already outlined, but I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page because I know I'm throwing a lot at you, I'm giving you lots of questions, I'm sure. But so my questions are really, understanding the obscurity of abolition in New England. And I know, you might wonder, it's like, well, there's nothing really obscure about it. I mean, slavery ended, but there's always a question of, when did it end? How long did it linger? And really, for me, what did the exact process look like, and how did the revolution figure into that? That's a very, very big question for me. So the role of the revolution, particularly the role of people of African descent, is crucial, and really trying to understand the processes of emancipation. I don't know if you've ever seen Emmy Muriel Taylor wrote a book, Embattled Freedom, about the Civil War, looking at emancipation during the Civil War. And I really like that she used that term, the processes. And I think we need to do that for emancipation during the Revolution, not just during the Civil War. Because you see, for me, the Revolution was a critical, very large emancipation moment. In fact, the largest one before the Civil War. And that's really how I'm trying to reframe the revolution, and with my arguments and joining other scholars in doing that. So you see, I'm turning away also from sort of the heroic legal narrative that essentially people in the legislatures, lawmakers, judges, people who are interpreting the law, they're the ones responsible, so to speak, for abolishing slavery in New England. I'm trying to turn away from that, or really complicating that narrative by looking at the role, particularly of people of African descent and the people that they connected with in their communities in New England. So there was really this new generation of, I almost try to put it lyrically here, but a new generation of freedom after the Revolutionary War. In other words, there were free Black communities after the Revolution that had not existed before. There were free Black people, for instance, in New England before the Revolution, but they were fairly small, and they became much larger after the Revolution. So I'm really interested in seeing how those communities formed because of the Revolution, and how they carried the memory of that forward. And so you see, it just in general, I'm reinterpreting the Revolution in the context of slavery and abolition. I'm trying to look at sort of really the critical tensions between, right, the challenges of slavery and this sort of these nascent connections and network building that was going on between white and Black activists intent on stopping the slave trade and slavery, and how that also compares to just ordinary people who happen to be negotiating their situation, fleeing or escaping slavery, or you're doing whatever they could just really to improve their lives, and sort of try to putting those two processes together. So I'm connecting emancipation in the aggregate. So just in general, we start with this many number of enslaved people here in 1774 and end with this many, and connecting that to sort of what I call the emancipation politics, sort of like the politics of how it happened, who was advocating when, how are they connecting with other people, what was the resonance or the impact of what they were trying to do, things like that. So I have pretty much laid out, all the fancy theoretical stuff, the argument stuff, as we say, the very technical term that we use in the ivory towers. And so now I want to move to a few sources that I looked at from the collections that I thought were super cool and that were super informative and illustrate kind of what I'm talking about in more concrete terms. So I'm going to start with a letter from Samuel Hopkins, whom you may know. He was a minister in Newport, to Levi Hart, who is a Connecticut minister. Hey, Connecticut, you're getting a shout out. And he was from Preston, Connecticut. And that was from 1775. And I actually was hoping I could show you. I'm going to show you that after I just talk a little bit about it. So essentially, Hart had a plan for gradual emancipation in Connecticut. He proposed a tax for pretty much, those that could pay taxes, the Connecticut colonists at the time. Of course, remember this is 1774, and that tax, and he calculated it based on the worth of the enslaved people in Connecticut at the time. At that time, there were about 5,000 or 5,100 roughly enslaved people in Connecticut, and he tallied up how much roughly they were worth, based on age and all that sort of stuff, the data that he had, and proposed a tax that could be paid, which would then go to the enslavers to reimburse them. So it's a gradual reimbursed emancipation, but of course it's the enslavers being reimbursed. And so, yeah, and this proposal that Hart makes is from 1774. It went unpublished, and it was unpublished, but it was something that ministers, at least Samuel Hopkins, I know, read it, and he gave his response to it. I'd like to compare also the plan that Hart had to a similar plan that Anthony Benezet had. I don't know if you know Anthony Benezet. He was a Philadelphia Quaker, and he had a similar plan for emancipation. There were very few, usually white ministers, who had plans for emancipation during this period. And you can say, oh, they're being overly idealistic, they're being overly optimistic, and so they may have been. And of course, they were moralizing quite a bit, because that's what they did. I mean, they were preaching quite literally. But I think it's critical to recognize these attempts at trying to imagine what emancipation looked like. Unfortunately for Hart, so Hart thought that the only way to really accomplish emancipation during the Revolution was to compensate enslavers. He thought, well, otherwise they're not going to agree to it, because remember, the Connecticut General Assembly and the other legislatures in New England were run essentially by people who were enslavers or who were very much invested in slavery and the slave trade. So I think that was a reality he recognized. I think it's something that Hopkins recognized. But Hopkins, in his letter, and I'd really like to show you all exactly what that letter looked like. It's the first one here. So Hopkins, he says essentially, well, I'm not sure about compensating enslavers. He raises this question because for him and some other ministers, I think the weight of the sin of slavery was so great that it needed to be done away with in order to essentially seek some kind of repentance, right, for that sin. And so the idea of compensating enslavers to free their enslaved people, it seemed to run in the face of that, and just seemed a bit untenable to him. Although I think he must have understood the practicality of that situation as far as getting enslavers to agree to something like that. So really, there's this question of, is it justice for the enslaved people or the enslavers? I think, for Hart, basically, you're making sure that the enslavers are okay with it because they're getting compensated, their fair market value or whatever. But really, enslaved people, the only justice they receive in that situation is freedom itself. And there's nothing else. There are no, it's like the only reparations, I suppose you might say, would be freedom. There were no land, no question of any further compensation for them for all the years they worked, unpaid, of course. And also just wanted to mention another publication. This is an actual publication that Levi Hart did put out, and a piece of writing that he did put out. So this was not as much an emancipation plan as much as a pamphlet which said that, we really need to support anti-importation laws. And just to clarify, so during this period of the Revolution, abolitionists, in the way that we think about them, did not really exist as far as trying to abolish the entire institution of slavery. There were a few that supported that, but very, very few. And actually, more than often, they were the few free or enslaved Black people that actually advocated for themselves and put out petitions, and which some of which are printed. And I'm going to show you at least one of them today. So he's saying that we need to support anti-importation, that's anti-slave importation, laws in New England and in the colonies more broadly. New England really led the way in proposing and successfully enacting, at least in the case of Connecticut and Rhode Island, laws, which did put a tax at least on slave importation, even though they didn't go nearly far enough for observers who noted, for instance, they just weren't strong enough to really stop the slave trade. And I think that was pretty clear, but it was at least, it was something. But so Hart was saying we need to support those laws. It's the first step. I think a lot of activists at the time would have agreed with him. It's really the first step towards moving toward emancipation. We start with ending slave importation, and then we move on to emancipation ultimately, we hope. And there's this really key phrase that he brings up that I want to draw your attention to at the bottom of the slide. We are the tyrants. So in other words, he and other active, you can call them, they were white colonists who were sympathetic with enslaved people. They were really trying to turn the rhetoric, the very common rhetoric of the time, against the British on its head, and to say, well, they're tyrannizing us. Well, we're tyrannizing African descended people, and we should be able to see this very, very clear parallel. It's hard to think that very many colonists were unaware of this parallel, of this comparison. And it was really a very pretty common rhetorical tool for people who were, quote unquote, anti-slavery at the time. Now, I know I mentioned sort of what I called the aggregate data, again, using my very fancy mathematical term of slavery and emancipation. So there's lots of bills of sale and many mission documents that I've found at the Connecticut Museum. And so I was able to compile those. So there were about 33 bills of sale. I found about 5 manumissions. And then if broken across time, you see 5 bills of sale in the 1760s, 13 in the 1770s, and 9 in the 1780s. So you see really a peak during the Revolutionary period. Now, of course, there didn't seem to be very many. I didn't include, there might have been a few bills of sale before, let's say in the 1750s. I don't think I found any in the 1790s, but or there might have been a few, but essentially there's a peak during the 1770s and 80s. But and those are bills of sale, right, for enslaved people. So slaveholding and slave trading were both fairly strong while being under attack from enslaved people, from Black activists, right, who were petitioning legislatures for freedom. And of course, under attack by the war itself, right, which cut the slave trade short for during the war years. So you see it's kind of contradictory, right? Yeah, so that we have the most records, right, for enslaved people being sold at the same time that there seems to be a nascent movement, right, to end the slave trade, to ultimately end slavery itself in New England. So I think that these tensions have to be borne in mind, I think, for us. So now there are a few documents that I wanted to highlight here that I found myself when I was just looking through stuff in the museum. Also, I wanted to note it's super cool looking at the old documents and just how many old documents that you're allowed to see yourself. I was just floored by that. I'd never had that opportunity in an archive before to just handle so many documents. It's almost like it's comparable to handling like a lot of old currency, and it kind of has that sort of smell, or like an old book. And just the tactile, the tangibility of it is just, I should just be writing my dissertation about that. But so there are a couple of documents I want to talk about. So there's the manumission of Bristow in 1775. That's right here. So this is a payment, actually describes a payment from an enslaved person, Bristow, to his former enslaver, Thomas Hart Hooker. You may know the name Hooker because that would be Thomas Hooker, right? This is a descendant, I believe, unless I'm very, very mistaken, of Thomas Hooker, the founder of Connecticut, who is distant relative of mine, actually. I only knew that because my mom tells me these things. Apparently, we're also related to Charlemagne, but we don't need to talk about that. So this is Thomas Hart Hooker, and his enslaved person bought his freedom from him for, I think it was about 60 pounds. And I wanted to note a comparison to a bill of sale up here, once I can get to it, a bill of sale from 1771. So actually, this is also for 60 pounds. So I wanted to note so that the amount that Bristow had to pay for his own manumission, which to my knowledge is not super common. I mean, I don't recall many instances of enslaved people. I mean, there were enslaved people that purchased their freedom. This was something that happened, but I'm not aware of a lot of manuscript documents that indicate that. But in other words, this enslaved person was being sold for the same amount that Bristow had to pay. And I think, I don't know, that's not something I'll be able to cover in my dissertation. But I thought that was, there's something there. There's something there. And I just wanted to highlight that for you all. And then lastly, for this slide, there is the case of a Will, who's another enslaved man. And so Jonathan Trumbull, governor at the time, had some testimony, but wrote a document about him. And a Will, apparently, as I say on the slide, I'm paraphrasing the document. He hated his enslaver for breaching the covenant regarding his promised freedom. And the reason why, and I'm sorry, I couldn't find a good picture of it on my phone. I have about 30,000 photos and I couldn't find it. But essentially, right, so his enslaver breached his covenant, the agreement regarding his freedom. And this is something that happened quite a bit actually outside of the war, but also during the war, right, when freedom or emancipation, manumission would be promised by enslavers for enslaved people, and then they would renege on that promise quite often, unfortunately far too often. But what's most interesting and what's most important is that enslaved people would make an appeal to an authority, whether it's the government, in this case, it's the governor, and would appeal and say, I've been wronged here, essentially, right? The old British practice of I have a grievance and I'm going to appeal to my governing authority and see if they can help me with it. So I think that's something that was happening at this time, and I think it's crucial to part of how slavery ended in Connecticut and New England, as far as enslaved people and free Black people essentially standing up for themselves and using these very traditional, very old-fashioned ways of, basically getting the governing authorities to help you, in this case with freedom. So here's where I turn to some of the more military sources. As you know, so there were about, I want to say, was it 800? There were 820 Black soldiers during the Revolutionary War from Connecticut. And that's out of about who fought for, I should say, fought for the Continentals, for the so-called the Patriots, out of about 5,000 total. Now, it seems like that number is being revised. Woody Holton seems to think it's closer to 9,000. The Daughters of the American Revolution put it closer to 6,000. So, there are still Black soldiers that we don't have records for. We can't quite account for, but we know they, anyway, we have names, but we don't have where they were from, things like that. So we're still accounting. We're still counting the numbers there. But there are a few documents that I found regarding Black soldiers, including this one, the John Henry petition, which is undated, unfortunately, because of course we do have a lot of documents relating to, for instance, Black soldiers either petitioning or applying themselves or having someone help them apply for pensions later in the 19th century. I'm not sure if this document this one right here actually relates it was from that period, or if it's shortly after the war, because I am aware of Black veterans who immediately after the war, they did apply for some kind of relief. And it's just unfortunate, of course, when you finally get to the pension applications in the early 1800s, a lot of the times those were denied, right? Because it's like, well, we don't really believe you served, and then of course they'd have to get, a backup testimony from friends, neighbors, people who knew them. Um, Moving on to this Connecticut Committee of the Pay Table account for troops. So this is pay table, and I just wanted to show this to you all. If I'm allowed, if my computer allows me to find it. There's John Henry, there's his petition. And if you study revolutionary military stuff, you see a lot of these pay table type documents. And on this document, you can see clearly people named like Pomp Liberty, so that there were Black men that served, obviously, and that you'll find them quite a bit on these sorts of documents. And and it can be a bit uneven as far as what the different states' policies were, but at least in Connecticut, the Black soldiers were being paid. From what I saw, and I think there are about 5 different Black soldiers on this document, it seemed like the Black soldiers were being paid roughly the same amount that the white soldiers were. But I will note that oftentimes that money didn't necessarily go to them. It might be sent back home to their enslaver, unfortunately. But I would also note that sometimes it would go to their enslaver. And the Black soldier, for instance, I went to the Connecticut State Archives, the State Library, and they would apply. They would ask the state to make sure that money went to them. They would petition for that money. So there was quite a bit of tension over pay. And who knows what was going on behind the scenes. But yeah, so we have lots of Black troops who were serving. And I would also note, so this is really late in the war, but it's 1777, which was really a key year, and that's a year that I'm currently writing about, or sort of ending. Chapter 4 for me sort of ends with the end of 1777. That's the year when the number of Black troops really spikes considerably in New England. And that's yes, it was just a really important year. And so basically from then on, there are lots of Black troops in the Army. And I think I just wanted to make one more note, about that. Scholars have talked about how many Black troops there were really in the Continental Army. When you match the number that we think, 5,000 or so, most of whom came from New England, by the way. It's about, if we trust the 5,000 number, it's about 3 in every 5, which is really very, very high. So Black New Englanders sort of served, disproportionately to their population. But basically, Black soldiers, if you take into account the number of soldiers who weren't fighting, who were sick, essentially at any given moment, there were plenty of Black soldiers serving, and that can and it would be a much higher proportion than the big numbers would tell you, as far as how many troops served overall in the war. But if you go to the actual moment in time, you'll see it's a much higher proportion. And then sorry, I skipped ahead a few. I wanted to, there was a promissory note there. So enslavers were being compensated for their enslaved people fighting, usually, substituting for them. The Connecticut passed a law in 1777, which enabled this. And lastly, I just wanted to note on this slide, the Sampson Cuff pension application. I believe I also came across it when I was at the Connecticut State Library. Also fantastic staff and lovely people and very welcoming. I wanted to note this because it really sort of represents, I think, the experience of a lot of Black veterans during the war, unfortunately, or shortly after. In his application, they ask him if he has anything, and this is in the early 1800s when there were older Black veterans who were applying for pensions, and he just says, "I have none." And I feel like that unfortunately represents a lot of the free Black experience, at least certainly for the Black veterans as they were getting older, and just not having very much. A few of them did have significant property and land, but that was much more uncommon. Now, There are a few more things I want to share before I round this out. I know we've got about 10 minutes, and I'm very much aware of that. So I mentioned Black land ownership, and I just wanted to expand briefly on this. There we go. So we have an enlistment certificate for London Wallace Jr. So London Wallace Sr. From Simsbury. I wanted to make note of the towns because I know y'all are probably from Connecticut, so you get a kick out of that. But London Wallace Sr., his father had served in the 7 Years' War and actually had land before the Revolution. And his son, London Wallace, as you see on the slide, he was indentured as a deal for some of that land. So London Wallace Sr. was buying and selling land and ended up actually selling land to the gentleman below, London Wallace, London Freebody, excuse me, right here. That's that London. London was somewhat of a common first name amongst this community. And so London Freebody, who also served in the Revolutionary War, bought land from Wallace Sr. after the war. So I became very interested while I was at the Connecticut Museum and the other places I visited, Newport, Providence, Boston, in Black land ownership, sort of how prevalent it was, and how that came to sort of help establish the free Black communities in New England after the war, right, where there wasn't as much Black land ownership before the Revolution, but after, there was actually a significant portion of Black landowners, and I think that really provided a lot of stability for those communities. Lots of Black heads of household, and of course, there's literacy and other things that go along with that. And lastly, on this slide, I wanted to note in the a resolve from the lower house of the assembly. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a copy of that to show you, but essentially, it was a proposed act to really, forbid free Black folks from getting land or having a farm without permission from the town. And this is early in the 1700s. And I believe it's connected to a gentleman by the name of Robert Jacklin, who was a free Black landowner in this early period. And I think there was, it must have caused some sort of degree of paranoia or something amongst the white legislators, and they decided to come up with this act. It did not pass, but you see how there's this concern about regulating free Black land ownership among white folks at this time. Now, here I wanted to note a few sources that are important to me and to my research outside of the Connecticut Museum collections, but which are of Connecticut, so they are very much relevant. So I have a few minutes here. I would just briefly mention Bristol Lambee's appeal that appeared in 1774. I was never able to find the copy of this which appeared in Connecticut, but this did appear in the Providence Gazette, as you can see, and it's the only surviving Black anti-slavery address in print from the Revolutionary period in Connecticut, right? So there were Black appeals, in other words, from Massachusetts. There were none, as far as I'm aware, and of course, I'm talking about freedom appeals, so asking the revolutionary governments for freedom on a collective scale, right? For Black people, let's say in Connecticut or in Massachusetts, right? Not just on an individual basis. So there were a smattering, really, quite the series of petitions in Massachusetts that predate this, actually going back to 1773. Nothing in Rhode Island. Eventually, there would be more petitions, not just in Connecticut, but also New Hampshire from Black men, free and enslaved Black men. So you can see Black Connecticut activists actually joining with a network, in a way, networking with Massachusetts Black activists, because his appeal, which I have right here, which was printed in the newspaper. So and it's very important also to note that Black appeals were being printed by friendly printers. They wanted their voices to be heard to some degree, despite their complicity with slavery in different ways. But he sees how, we have a natural right to be free. This was the language of the Black activists of the time, starting with, again, Massachusetts. a lot of this language is actually copied from the Black petitions in Massachusetts. So I think there's a big connection there. I mean, Bristol Lambie must have been familiar with the Massachusetts petitions and built upon them. So copied some language and then built in his own, adding at the very end. There have been sundry petitions of this tenor to the legislative body of this colony for our relief. So apparently there were other Black Connecticut petitions. I have not been able to find them before 1779. Other than this, there's in the journal, the Legislative Journal of Connecticut, does note the receipt of a Black petition in May 73, but we don't actually have the copy of what that petition looked like. So this is really the closest that we have to what those Black Connecticut petitions probably look like. But it's important that he's noting that there were other petitions, and he's saying that this is a wider, or you might even say organized initiative, really, to get some relief from the government, relief being emancipation. And also, of course, he says, we ask no more in compensation for all of our toils and sufferings than only to be released from our present confinement, referring to slavery. So we just have a couple minutes here. So I'll just briefly go over this last, it's the last source I wanted to share with you all, which is a petition from the town of Enfield. And this is not found in the Connecticut Museum collections, but this is an example of the towns, so not just individual activists, but actual towns. Danbury did a very similar thing in 1774, actually resolved to be against slavery, and in this case, actually asked the legislature for emancipation, which is a very rare thing, but I think it shows really just how strong the anti-slavery, activism impulse was becoming, right? It wasn't just rhetoric, but people were doing things. They were saying things to people that mattered and trying to make change. And I'll just note that the Enfield petitioners here in 1777, which again is a key year, they were using the phrases that the Black abolitionists, and I call them abolitionists because they were trying to abolish slavery, were using. So I think there's real connections and network building between these two groups, right? The free and enslaved Black people, and then the white folks who supported them. Now, and that's that document from the state archives, actually. I was able to get that at least, so you can see what those sorts of documents look like. Now, for my conclusion, I just wanted to, because I don't want to talk all day, but there are a few things that, as I've already mentioned, that I'm pretty much really interested in. So the different visions of emancipation, whether they be Black or white, or the descent between those communities, what would emancipation look like during the revolution, after the revolution? What does belonging look like? I feel like that's a really important term. I use that quite a bit instead of just citizenship, because belonging is what freedom, quote unquote, legal freedom, what that is actually going to mean. So it's actually very critical. And so looking at sort of the different differences around what those visions are. And, was there a shift in public, quote unquote, public opinion during the revolution, a shift in conscience, a crisis of conscience? Was there a decline in slaveholding? And I think, well, there was. And also, what were the opportunities of war? What opportunities were enslaved and free Black people using to destroy slavery, as well as, white ministers, right, advocating, using the opportunity of war to say, this is the time to emancipate. And I think that there were certain criteria of Black leadership. And I say Black leadership because I call the Black folks that were petitioning on behalf of their communities Black leaders, because I think that's essentially how they saw themselves. And I think there's a critical mass of land ownership, head of household status, and literacy and military service. One or more of those things can combine and really enable certain Black folks during this period to advocate and to have the ability and the capacity to do that. Now, there are a few takeaways I wanted to leave you all with. I know we're about done, but I just wanted to say so the Connecticut enslaved population, because I know my talk is themed around the fall of slavery in Connecticut, it declined really significantly during the Revolutionary period. So you see, I mean, the numbers here going from 4 to 5,000 to 2,759. The census numbers, they can't always be completely trusted, but it seems that as much as 50%, if not more, of the enslaved population went away. They either moved or became free, technically, legally at this time. And I think a large part of that was the number of Black soldiers, some of whom were free, but the majority of whom were enslaved. And them becoming free was a large part of this. So the last thing I'll say before Jen takes it away for the questions is that I think that the Gradual Abolition Act of 1784, which you may be familiar with in Connecticut, so that was responding to a process of emancipation already underway. So I think I will leave it there. I think I've talked enough, and I will give it over to Jen and to any questions you may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, William. That was really interesting. I learned a lot, for sure. I had a question. Well, I'm give people a minute to add questions to the chat, and I'll go through them. But I wanted to ask a question to get us started. You mentioned the one instance of someone using the legal system to help enforce that the enslaver gave freedom after serving in his place in the American Revolution. Did you find any other examples of when enslaved people used the legal system, whether it was tied to the American Revolution or just trying to find abolition through the legal system?
Yeah, there's been a lot of great work on so-called freedom suits. You all may have heard that term before. Ironically, a lot of freedom suits, that is, court cases brought on by enslaved people, which was, by the way, also a rarity. New England allowed enslaved people to go to court and sue their enslaver, whether if it was over their contract being wrong, something about the title of their enslavement being wrong, that sort of thing. I am aware that actually these freedom suits, whether they be, if they were about enslaved people trying to gain their freedom. Yeah, right. It's right. The major suit, the Quack Walker case, these really peaked during the 1770s, and then also in the 1780s when the Quack Walker takes place in really Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, where the Quack Walker suit takes place. So and Jared Ross Hardesty has written about this in his first book, Unfreedom, but I'll just say, essentially, enslaved people, they weren't just, let's say, running away. They weren't just negotiating with enslavers behind the scenes. They were using the available legal and state apparatuses. So I think that's, very interesting. They were aware of what they could do, and they made use of those mechanisms. So absolutely, Jen, absolutely.
Great, thanks. We have a question. Are you or will you be addressing gender issues in the context of emancipation?
Right. This is a very, very, very good question, because there's been a lot of great work about gender and abolition emancipation in revolutionary New England. I'm thinking about Karen Cook Bell's Running from Bondage. I'm thinking of Catherine Adams and Elizabeth Fleck's Love of Freedom. That's also a very, very good one. That's specifically about enslaved women during the Revolution. That is not quite, this is something I'll definitely have to bring up in the introduction. Let me tell you that much. It's something that I will have to talk about and bracket, because the folks that I'm focusing on are people, mainly men. There are some exceptions, for instance, like Phyllis Wheatley Peters, who definitely advocated for herself and for her community in Boston, for instance. But for the most part, I'm looking at enslaved and free Black men, and then as well as white activists, who thought they were representing their communities. And scholars that I've read talk about how, well, I mean, that was essentially the case, that, that Black men were in the position to be able to do that, right? Seeing themselves as more or less sort of the patriarchs, and sort of these are the guys who were submitting the petitions. They were connecting with the legislators. So long story short, that's something that I'm going to have to talk about as far as, I'm going to have to talk about exactly how I'm using gender, because I'm afraid that a lot of times when I talk about my research, it's something that I don't talk about explicitly, but it's still something I'm still talking about anyway, if that makes sense. So I think that's definitely a really good piece of advice for me, and I'm going to take that forward with me. So thank you for that question.
Brenda also had a question or comment. You use the word justice when talking about it being applied to enslavers, and then is that a word they use themselves, or can you contrast that in any way to using the word justice for enslaved people?
So
Does
interestingly
that make
enough,
sense?
it does make sense. The Black activists who wrote things, who petitioned, whose writing we do have, they did not use the term justice. When I'm talking about, at least from the petitions, from the text I've read, the justice that I'm aware of, I'm talking about the stuff that Levi Hart and Samuel Hopkins were saying, the ministers. That was, the idea of divine justice and the idea that, we have to be careful, otherwise there will be punishment from God, right? If we don't undo the sin of slavery. And also, yeah, I wanted to say I appreciate that comment about using gender as an analytical framework. It's not something I mention as much here, but I think it's essentially something I'll be fleshing out more in my own writing. But thank you for bringing that up, and I apologize for not focusing on it as much in this presentation. But thank you so much for bringing it to my attention.
Deborah was just commenting that I believe it was Hart's sermon. It was more than just a pamphlet. It was the election day sermon,
Mm.
and that which Connecticut passed in the session following the sermon. I just wanted to make, in case you weren't aware.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Deborah had a question as well. What percentage of slaves were freed by or before serving in the Revolution? I think you kind of addressed it. It's hard to get at some of those numbers.
Yeah, it is. It is. One number I'll leave you with. So looking at Rhode Island census records, and then it's just the number that people throw around for how many free Black people, for instance, there were in the colonial period of the Revolutionary period. It's really, really hard to trust those numbers. What I have found, I think it's about using the data that we have about the Black soldiers, some of whom were identified as free or enslaved. I think it's about 15% of the Black soldiers that served, for instance, from Connecticut, were free by the time that they served. And the rest of those people, I think we can understand those men were enslaved or were formerly enslaved, with the expectation of receiving freedom or manumission by the end of their service. So really looking at about like a 15 to 85% breakdown.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment about comparing wages. You mentioned that one enslaved person had to pay $60 for for manumission, and this gentleman is mentioning in 1771 a skilled tradesman might earn 40 to 60 pounds per year. So I don't know
Wow, that really puts it in perspective.
Yeah, so that would be a full year's income for if you were to compare that to modern. They're suggesting it might be between 40 and 60,000, which, obviously is quite a lot.
Right.
And Rhonda is mentioning that Black soldiers were not paid the same as whites. I think you mentioned everything was sort of across the board. There's all sorts of way it shook out.
Right.
But that's interesting to compare payrolls to see if there was any consistency in how Black soldiers were paid versus white soldiers.
Absolutely.
Tom is mentioning that Venture Smith from Stonington purchased his freedom for 71 pounds in 1765. So that's kind of on
That's
par
a great
with
data point. Thank you for that. That's a great data point.
Yeah. And let's see. Eric put in the chat that I will send the link to you, William. There's another website where you can read Bristol Lambie's petition. So I'll send that to everybody when I send out the YouTube link. And Tom is mentioning that Robert Jacqueline's experience in New London in 1717 is part of the New London Black Heritage Trail. The
Mm,
town held a referendum to prohibit Blacks from owning property or businesses in New London, and they assigned their delegates to promote this policy for the entire colony of Connecticut. It passed the
mm,
lower assembly, but failed to pass the full house.
exactly.
That's interesting.
Hmm.
And Deborah also put in another link on Bristol Lambie, so I'll get that to everyone. Jim has a question. Of the 800 Black soldiers who served with Connecticut's militia, how many were freed in light of their service? I think that, again, that was a little bit tricky to get at. I don't know if you have.
Yeah. Yeah. And the 820 soldiers number that comes from a Liberty Fund study. Actually, I used some of their figures in my research. They're the ones that it's funded by a group that's trying to establish a memorial, I believe, on the National Mall for Black soldiers, to honor Black soldiers during the Revolutionary War. So out of the 820 soldiers that served, I think right about 15% based on the rolls that I looked at, the military rolls, and that they were published actually. I have the exact name. Listen, Returns of Connecticut Men in the Revolution is the book that I looked at. So I estimate, based on the rolls I saw in there from 1777 to 1779, that about 15% of those men were free, just at least in that instance. So if you generalize that, so then you're talking about, right. So I mean, out of 800, right, you're talking about 600 so would have been enslaved. Um, and presumably those men, most of those men would have been freed by the end of the war, but there were cases of enslaved men not even receiving their freedom, as we talked about, enslavers reneging their promise, and that was very much
Right.
documented. Yeah.
Um, Irene is commenting that she's struck by the similarities of political activism then and now, although using very different technology. Interesting.
Mm,
Yep. Caroline is mentioning the co-walker. Um, not, let's see, a comment just about I think it's a missed opportunity not to put people of color, men and women, at the center of this research, scholarship, and presentation. I think you're still in your early stages, if I can guess, correct?
right. Yeah. I mean, and this is just, these are snapshots, but I
One
appreciate.
chapter.
Yeah, exactly. But I appreciate, and I don't always present things, as well as I could, But I think no, I think that's an important point, though. I appreciate that, and that's something, as I said, like that I'm building on a long stream of scholarship that really is trying to center those voices. So I appreciate that comment all the same.
Absolutely. Chris is asking, Tony Bartram used the British raid on Fairfield in 1779 excuse me, 1779 to flee with his two daughters to New York with the British soldiers. So there's a lot of other examples of where people went, what they did, how things shook out at the end. Um, if they weren't sure they were going to be guaranteed freedom. Um, there's another example of Prince Duplex was a slave, but entered
Hmm.
service as a freeman of color from Southington, and he soon after the Revolution purchased land in Farmingbury, which is now part of Wilcott or maybe Southington. Any thoughts on when enslaved advocated for their freedom when it was met with more resistance than when whites advocated?
Mm. Well, I will give one example. For instance, I do know that the Bristol Lambie appeal in the Providence Gazette, that was, I believe that there was a Connecticut writer in another newspaper who did respond to what Bristol Lambie was saying directly, and not completely positively either. When the Black petitioners in Massachusetts submitted their freedom petitions to the legislature, those were pretty much dismissed, and the legislature was like, "Okay, we're not going to do anything about emancipation. That's too much. We're going to do something about the slave trade and put a tax on slave importation." So I think, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, even when Black folks were putting their writing in spaces where the white leaders could read them, they weren't always taking those concerns very seriously and diverted it into something that was more understandable to them, as far as taxing the slave importation, for example.
Gotcha. Tom's asking, how did Lord Dunmore's proclamation and the Phillipsburg Proclamation impact the emancipation or abolition movement?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so the Lord Dunmore's yeah, so they were kind of the emancipation proclamations, right? That the British issued during the war. Of course, Lord Dunmore being the last royal governor of Virginia, and Phillipsburg, I believe that was Henry Clinton, General Clinton's proclamation. So I guess the only thing I'll say about this is not something I've studied as much. The British side, I'm more focused on the continental side, because I'm looking at New England. But I would say that I think there was this clash between essentially sort of like, are the Continentals or the British more moral on the issue of slavery? And I think that's something that they lambasted each other about. And I think the Lord Dunmore's proclamation and then the other proclamation you mentioned, those were sort of flashpoints, where the British were using emancipation as a military tool to defeat the colonists, and the colonists were aware of that. So, yeah, so it's kind of hard to answer this. I would just have to say I'd have to do more research on the British side, but this is just such a great question because I think this is critical to understanding emancipation and abolition during the war years. So I'll just say thank you so much for your comment. I'll have to do some more thinking about that.
And Deborah mentions that the New Haven Museum has the Journal of Josiah Atkins online, and he mentions the horrible treatment of former slaves serving the British during Yorktown, around Yorktown. Well, thank you so much for all these great questions and comments. So much to add to the research that is already, I'm sure, a huge project. But we would love to have you back when you are when it's complete, and we can talk more about all. It's such an interesting topic. There's just so much to it, and I really enjoyed your presentation today and learning about your project. And so I hope we'll have you back.
Thank you, Jenny. And I hope to be back. And I just want to say I really appreciate everyone's engagement. It was really productive for me and for the rest of us. So I just wanted to say thank you to you all. You've always been so warm and kind and welcoming at Hartford.
Yeah, a lot of great insights from our viewers today. So we appreciate that, of course. I just before we go, want to just highlight a couple of upcoming events that we have going on. We have our next Lunch and Learn, also on the American Revolution, songs of colonial and revolutionary America. We'll listen to a few songs from the time period, and music historian Robert Cohen will help us understand the role music played during the Revolution. Then we have a trivia night, and it'll be the Y2K edition, so we'll have trivia all about the 2000s with some fun prizes. And then we have a lecture on site at the museum on March 26th, Stone Footprints, the Wandering Plaque of 1911. Jennifer Clow, the executive director of the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford, will share exciting new research that illuminates the experiences of Jewish immigrants from the North End of Hartford. And that is ties into one of our new exhibitions drawn here. So hopefully you can join us for that. And those are just a few of our upcoming events. Of course, everything is online. But again, William, thank you so much for an interesting, enlightening presentation today. And thank you to everyone for coming. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye, everybody.